It's my great delight to be able to welcome you all today to another Monash Social Contract Research Network seminar. It's a particular pleasure because today we're welcoming to the seminar Sophia Rosenfeld, Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania, and the author of the acclaimed new book, The Age of Choice, A History of Freedom in the Modern World. Professor Rosenfeld's work, spanning from common sense, a political history, and truth and democracy, has, I think, really shaped how we think about modern political culture. And in thinking about the age of choice, he traces how contracts and popular sovereignty and voting all intertwined from the 18th century to today, showing how choice became really a stand-in for the idea of freedom. And what the consequences of that are for our social contract and for our obligations to one another. Her title today is Thinking About the Age of Choice. So please would you join me with me in welcoming our speaker for today, Sophia Rosenfeld.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, and I'm delighted to be here. And I can't see the participants in this conversation, but I thank you for being here and for participating, and thank you to Monash University, who's the sponsor of this program. I'm going to start talking in a kind of historical vein more than a contemporary vein, but I hope to get us eventually sort of back to the present. And mainly my subject this evening is going to be choice, which I think becomes clear pretty quickly how connected it is to questions of contracts all the way through. And by that, I mean everything from specific contracts, like a marriage contract, to abstract notions like the social contract. All right, let me say, now you hopefully can see that I'm sharing the cover, very familiar, of the great pamphlet called Common Sense of Tom Paine, in which he made this eloquent case for not just the rule of people over kings, but for choice over the folly of hereditary right. And after 1776, so did most of his American contemporaries. A good number of them were, of course, just following his lead. It was an incredibly influential pamphlet at its moment. But the notion of a government built on citizens' choice became a leitmotif of US politics in the first years after independence. And as Alexander Hamilton famously put it in the first paragraph of the first of the Federalist Papers, this is a very well-known quote, but I'm going to read it because I think it's relevant right here. It has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, by their conduct and example, to decide the important question, here goes the question, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice. We might call this consent of the governed or the social contract, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force, unquote. None of that strikes most of us as odd today. It might even strike us as commonsensical, to use the terms of Paine, though his claims were actually not very commonsensical in their moment. We're all, after all, I'm talking to people around the world here, but most of us are going to be equally familiar with the idea that we're constantly asked to make choices in a whole range of different domains in our everyday lives. We shop for, everything from coffee beans to housing to vacations. We select ideas, entertainments, friends, lovers, professions, jobs, places to live, even insurance plans to hedge our bets when something happens that we can't have actually picked. And crucially, and I say this at this moment, sitting here in the United States, I don't want to take this for granted too much, we still regularly vote. One activity that, at least in principle, requires a similar kind of activity to the other activities I just mentioned, in that it requires us to peruse a menu of 2 or more options, to consider what best corresponds to our personal preferences among the possibilities on offer, and then to register that determination in our actions, which is what we generally mean today by make a choice. And indeed, we're so used to this kind of activity and all the rules and behavioral codes that go with it. I'm imagining, I believe it's lunchtime in Melbourne, so maybe some of you have already just, picked something off a menu for lunch or are about to when this ends. Most of us are very used to not just doing this, but celebrating having the opportunity to do so in so many different domains. A passion for individual preference-driven choice is an activity that now crosses many different political divisions. In the US, for example, we talk about both school choice on the right and reproductive choice on the left. We generally only disagree about what the options should be, not the principle of maximizing either the options or the opportunities to make choices. And what strikes me as so important here, and maybe not noticed enough, is how much, therefore, the consumer culture and advertising uses so many of the same tropes and formulations as do constitutions and charters all over the world today. Choosing, whether it's a new teapot or through aggregation, a new leader, is understood as a crucial way to get what we want. That means to shape our own lives, to shape our lifestyles to our own tastes. But even more, the idea of being seen as someone who's capable of having and making choices has become fundamental to having the standing and dignity of a full-fledged adult human being. In other words, in modern life, choice is often taken to be the central hallmark of freedom. And even as behavioral economists tell us we're not very good at it, we don't know our own minds, we're confused, we're easily persuaded by the wrong things. And even as philosophers tell us that too much emphasis on choice ends up having us blame people with limited options for their own misfortunes and to ignore communal needs, we rarely doubt that this activity, choosing, is something that's sort of what humans were made to do. And most of us are therefore inclined to think it's sort of always been this way, that we've spent our lives as citizens in capitalist democracies doing this, and this is really what human nature entails. So what do I want to suggest? I'm a historian, after all. Historians always think things aren't the same in two different moments. And I want to suggest there's a big disjunction between what choice, or for that matter, freedom, meant in 18th century terms for Paine and his contemporaries, and really in the heyday of social contract theory, and what it means today. And I think this is something we've largely overlooked in our desire to see continuity between the age of revolutions and our own moment. But I think if we start paying a little more attention to the discrepancy, the difference, we might see something about how democracy has evolved in the US, but really globally from the era of Paine onwards. And we might therefore be able to think a little differently about the present. So that difference, sticking with the theme of choice, is really going to be my theme for this seminar. So I want to start then by going back to the 18th century for a moment, and then we'll kind of move our way forwards. Because there's also something very striking from a historian's perspective about all that revolutionary era talk about abiding by the people or the nation's choice, not to mention Hamilton's famous formulation that the United States is founded on choice rather than force, and that's what's going to be distinctive about contractual nations founded in constitutions from the 1790s onwards. And that's something I want to call attention to, is what I would call actually an absence. Because for all of the passing mentions of choice in political life, including, you'll see Paine's own epitaph on the epigraph on the front of Common Sense, very rarely noted quote from the Scottish poet Thomson. Here's an odd fact about the late 18th century. Nowhere in the Age of Revolutions was there much discussion in the last decades of the 18th century and really into the early 19th about how to organize an election, or how all this choosing, even when it was going to be essential to popular sovereignty, was supposed to work. In the early US state constitutions, there's surprisingly little attention paid to the subject. Paine says nothing about elections at all, and neither do most of his contemporaries. Ditto for the French Revolution, as Condorcet is the one exception there. Generally, choice, even political choice, remains an abstraction. It's as abstract an idea as the state of nature. And I think that's worth thinking about, why choice doesn't take a concrete form, even as we're told it'll be the foundation of whole new nations and ways of being. That's the theoretical side. But even if we look in practice, early historians of suffrage have shown us that methods of voting in the 18th into the 19th century, I'll stick with the US, we'll go to other places in a moment, were remarkably heterogeneous, most of the time being adaptations of older norms borrowed from private clubs, town meetings, church or city governments prior to the age of revolutions. Balloting, should be familiar for Australians in particular, we'll get to that in a moment, was one old way of registering political choices that was sometimes adopted in the new United States and in revolutionary France, but really a kind of radical heterogeneity remained the norm. In the first decades of the new United States, multiple forms of selection in multiple kinds of elections continued to be used. People voted viva voce or haute voix, out loud. Sometimes they raised their hands. Sometimes people moved to one side of the room or the other. Or they could put beans or bullets or lots into a box. And paper balloting was used too, and sometimes with full publicity, where people announced who they voted for, sometimes rather secretly, and sometimes just general acclamation was used and counting would be damned altogether. And entities frequently reversed themselves since there was no single standard that might be thought of as a best practice. So the framers of the first constitution for the state of New York in 1777 announced that people would try voting on paper ballots, but they call it an experiment, so as to suggest that it could be reversed at any time. And there was no consistent political vision tied to any of these methods of choice either. The demands for secret ballots, for instance, were sometimes a project of working men, worried about pressure from bosses and landlords from above and eager to be free of perceived coercion, as they would be for the Chartists and for the Chartist-inspired advocates for the secret ballot in Australia by the middle of the 19th century. But secret ballots in the US were used just as often for voter suppression and the disenfranchisement of Black people in the South and immigrants all over, following a pattern that started with Native peoples. In other words, if you can't figure out the forms, you can't vote. It was that simple. And the secret ballot could equally be encouraged as a way to combat imagined pressure from below and to help secure the opinion of elites than the other way around. And as you probably know, the federal Constitution of the United States left almost everything about elections up to states. We're still seeing that today. States and localities, which means that there were very few standards to this day that are universal, apart from the requirement of secrecy, which is a much later development we'll come back to in a moment. But you might think maybe the American case is a peculiarity. Well, in France, the situation was similar after 1789. And despite a similar kind of liking for the rhetoric of choice, this is, of course, the land of Rousseau, the great theorist of the social contract of the late 18th century, there existed nothing like a menu of options, or what we'd call a slate of candidates to pick from. So voters in 1790 were required to swear under oath to name, quote, only those whom you have chosen or choisi in your souls and conscience as the most worthy of public confidence, but without offering any guidance as to who those people might be. So, and the idea was to simply that everybody should identify who was the most virtuous and appropriate embodiment of the sentiments of the community as a whole. It was also assumed that nobody would run for office because nobody wanted to suggest they had the potential for ruling over others. So the objective was to leave all options open, even if it led on occasion to such a profusion of different names being put forth that there was no real choice at all, because there was no choice set, as choice theorists would call it. And in England, it was the opposite. Elections for MPs were rarely competitive in the last part of the 18th century. And when competitive ones did occur, they were more like public ceremonies. Votes were only tallied if the candidates called for it. So what's the point here? The real point is that choice as an idea was not routinely translated in the age of democratic revolutions into a practice or even a plan that we would recognize as choice making now. And that might seem surprising given that we think of voting as an area of endless fights. And there were, of course, fights steadily about who should have the vote, and how to protect that vote in various ways, but very little about how to do it. How do we then explain this? Sometimes important to also say, how can we explain a disinterest as well as an interest? And I think the answer starts from the premise that though we tend to think of democracy, then called republicanism, as something established in the Age of Revolutions by documents like the US Constitution and subsequently by other constitutions that established the sovereignty of the people, with just the numbers of those people expanding and their kind over time, I think it's quite clear that Paine, like most spokespeople of that moment, had something quite different in mind when he spoke of choice. And I'm going to say the same goes for the French revolutionaries. First, their idea of choice was something much less individualistic or rooted in personal predilections. For in an era before mass suffrage, elections were never described as opportunities for individual people, whoever they were, to register their private sentiments one by one. Those with the franchise were told that they were explicitly voting, as they had in England, on behalf of others, including children and wives and other dependents, not just on themselves. In other words, the vote was much more of a trust than a right, even as the people were given the right to vote. Second, elections were imagined to be much more communal affairs, rife with celebrating and a kind of general atmosphere of rowdiness, but also with the goal of community reinforcement. Political choice was given, as it was for Hamilton, to the nation, to the people, to the public, to collective bodies. And choice making was importantly not meant to be divisive. And I think that's one reason it was so little talked about by people like Paine, who didn't want to imagine the people being divided in their sentiments, but wanted to imagine something much more like a consensus. If you discuss voting in great detail, you're already imagining there's going to be strife. And in an era before formal politics, finally, a moral rhetoric of right and wrong, of what was the public good versus personal selfishness, rather than some idea of lots of different visions getting aggregated at the end, ruled the day. And in what might now strike us as a kind of magical thinking, it was imagined that a right course would be found as a result of something like a general consensus. It doesn't have to be exactly Rousseauian, but there's an element of this that comes out in all of the early discussions of choice. To make this clearer, let me show you a different image. Let's see. Now, can I advance this? Okay. Everybody see that? Okay. All right. This is a famous 18th century motif. Some of you may recognize the choice of Hercules. It's probably the most famous allegory for choice in the early modern period. There were versions by Shaftesbury, Handel, Bach, where there were Wedgwood medallions. You could visit gardens described on the theme, and it's always the same. In the middle stands Hercules, and you can see he's kind of torqued, like he's, looking into his options. And he's torn between virtue and vice, allegorized as two different women, the right course of action and the wrong. And he always, in the end, is more seduced by what's right, what is correct. He chooses virtue or duty to others, as all good men would. And this was an oft-repeated story about free will that was made very consonant with Christianity. John Adams thought it would be a great subject for the seal of the new United States, though that did not happen. But this is the vision, I think, of choice that still underlies notions of choice when they appear around political choice and around the social contract, for that matter, in the 18th century. So the real question for me became, how does this come undone? What happens so that choice starts to look much more like this preference-driven, value-neutral notion that's so familiar to us today in so many domains, and now including politics too. Let me show you a second 18th century image. Okay, a little bit later, but not, I deliberately picked sort of two 18th century images to start. And this is a print after a lost painting by the French Rococo painter Fragonard. And this time, there's a woman in the center. She's dressed as a shepherdess, but she's supposed to be very modern. She's a coquette, what was a translation really for a flirt. And she's a lightweight, like she's a silly woman in some ways. That's the premise. But now her choices, interestingly, are inverted. They're male choices. She's choosing between two suitors dressed like shepherds. But interestingly, they don't have any moral weighting. They don't stand for anything beyond themselves. Her choice, she's again kind of leaning in two directions, trying to make up her mind. But her choice in the end is whichever one she prefers. It's a purely preference-driven choice. The coquette is not yet the dominant notion of the chooser in the 18th century. She's often disparaged, though. She's very much thought of as a modern type. This is the logic of the supermarket, of the dating site, rather than Hercules. It's also the logic of modern advertising, and it's also the logic, frankly, of the modern constitution and charters that often and usually grant a range of areas in which the individual is accorded choice, from education to housing to marriage, and yes, politics too. In the 18th century, these two modes are in some kind of tension. And I don't want to suggest that the one just instantly wins out over the other, but the coquette has a kind of endurance that's interesting. And it's not because any one philosopher argued for it. It's not it's not simply once there's popular sovereignty, the modern voter appears out of nowhere. I would argue that the modern voter, who's also the person who's choosing everything from socks to wear in the morning to a breakfast cereal, has developed as much out of a range of different social practices, all of them importantly away from the workplace, that gradually transformed individual people into leisure time modern choosers. And they did this both on their own and with the help of people that we might call, using the behavioral economist terms, choice architects, who start to establish elaborate infrastructures and rules, both formal and informal, to make it all work. To make this new kind of freedom possible required a whole armature of new kinds of practices and rules. So let me tell you a little bit about the storyline that I think led this direction. And please, I hope in the question answer period, you'll push back on any or all of this, because I know that I'm straying quite far and away from the world of politics to tell this political story, but delving into all sorts of other realms. The story of how choice came to take its modern form is really the story of the mainstreaming of the coquette that we're seeing here. And it's also the story of the undoing of the 18th century vision of the social contract, even as the number of people who engage in it continue to grow. Choice on this newer model, I believe, got its start from two very different beginnings, neither of which was political to begin with. One was commercial, the realm of the shop, which is where my book on choice begins. It has two beginnings, but that's one of them. From the backwoods of Virginia to the big cities of Northern Europe, the shop became the space for a new activity. And that was something that it's a neologism of the same moment as the Age of Revolutions, shopping took place. And shopping, an English term that gets used in other languages even before there's a cognate for it, was often centered on initially fabrics, cloth, imported calicos from India, for instance, because they offered ordinary people a new experience. And that experience in part was selecting from a range of possibilities that were not necessarily cued to status or any even financial difference in many cases, but sometimes came down to, do you like the stripes or the checks better? Do you like the yellow or the blue? And we can look at a range of things, from the development of sample books to glass shop windows, to show how choice making became a feature of commercial life. And the term making a choice and shopping often of choice goods, meaning sort of pre-selected objects, comes to be one realm in which I think we can find one space where the coquette or the modern chooser has a real domain. And we might say that's the beginning of consumer or aesthetic choice. But this is not a story entirely about economics taking over from everything else. The other source is really religion, a post-Reformation fracturing of Christianity and a Protestant tradition of freedom of conscience gradually produced something parallel. I don't even want to say similar, but the idea of a pluralist world in which people could start engaging in new social practices or activities that again were rooted in preference for some ideas over others. Not cloth this time, but a world in which, in my home city of Philadelphia, for instance, people in the 18th century tried out preachers by going to hear more than one kind of sermon on a Sunday morning. It was a tourist activity in the 18th century. Public lectures start taking place. Lending libraries develop. Commonplacing becomes an activity in which one selects from a variety of different texts, trying to link some kind of sense of internal self with outward expression, a practice that doesn't make sense until there is a kind of pluralism behind it. And I don't want to exaggerate. And, the Paine still thought that the distinctions were rooted in heaven. I mean, he didn't think all choices were equally good. And relativism is too strong a word here. And of course, many people, including the enslaved around the world, had almost entirely no choices in the 18th into the 19th century. And this kind of choice making of the coquette continues to, it's both appealing and it's problematic. But you can think of Jane Austen, who's one of the first people to really describe this new ethos. She makes fun of her fictional heroine in Mansfield Park, who gets up her nerve to subscribe to a lending library and is, quote, amazed at her own doings in every way, to be a renter, a chooser of books. And Jane Austen's clearly making fun a little bit of her character's timidity in the face of proliferating choice. But she's also telling us something about the novelty and the appeal of this new kind of freedom that's quite far from the mode of Hercules and orchestrated by a very different set of choice architects. And I can go on with the story. In the 19th century, choice comes for the realm of romance and sex, and we can start talking about affective and bodily choice related to the rise of companionate marriage, and accordingly, a very elaborate etiquette, very gender specific about how to choose, that's regulated as much by social norms as it is by formal laws. Marriage itself becomes known as the choice in the 19th century novel. And by the 20th century, this kind of organized picking has become so naturalized that we generally fail to link it with the fact that many of the modern social sciences make the study of choice their central question, from psychology to marketing to economics. These are fields in which the study of how humans make choices, which ones they make, why they make the ones they do, is central. And again, you might think this is a sort of top-down process, but ordinary people participated every time they filled out marketing surveys and sent back forms in magazines or sat on a psychologist's couch. By the end of the Second World War, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and into modern feminism, it almost seems axiomatic by this point that when humans are going to have freedom, it means they will have choice, that rights and choice are coterminous in ways that are not at all apparent in the Declaration of the Rights of Man or in the Declaration of Independence. But it's important to this story, and this is really I think the crux of the matter, that choice on the mode of the coquette, this kind of value neutral, preference driven choice, doesn't really make it into political life, especially in parts of the former British Empire and then the world, until the second half of the 19th century, almost 100 years later. And it's well known that the 19th century was marked by intense debates about who should vote as democratic processes spread from a newly constituted Germany to Latin American states. But we don't spend that much energy thinking about how much attention went 100 years later to the question of how should people vote. And it never became a mass movement. But there's endless debate, starting with the Chartists, about what choosing in the realm of politics should really entail. And we can look at this, of course, in theoretical texts like those of Mill, but we can also look at it in practice. And what's here interesting is that the person you might think would be the most enthusiastic about this new mode of choosing around the secret ballot, for instance, John Stuart Mill, who becomes the great advocate in general for the idea of self-determination on an individual basis through the making of choices and the picking of a life plan. In fact, Mill is one of the last opponents of the secret ballot. Why? Because he actually continued to believe that politics should be the one domain that continued to uphold the value of communal decision-making over private determinations, of attention to the common good as opposed to individual taste, and to value-laden rather than value-neutral choosing, all of which he associated both with Englishness, but also with manliness, back to Hercules. In fact, he continued to hold on to the notion that even if choice in its other forms had come to romantic life, consumer life, intellectual life, that political liberty should still be anchored in this older Herculean vision. And in the realm of practice, I think we've sometimes forgotten how late secrecy in voting became a universal standard. It was, as I do not have to tell this audience, I'm sure, first instituted in Australia in the 1850s, hence what's still called sometimes in the United States, the Australian ballot. England followed suit, but only after 1872, with this newfangled idea that if voting were a right rather than a trust, the voter needed to be isolated from pressure to be able to vote his own conscience and indeed his own personal preferences. The US doesn't follow suit till the 1890s. Kentucky is still voting viva voce in the 1890s. France tries out ballots in the mid-19th century, but doesn't add the curtained voting booth, the so-called isoloir, the isolation space, or an envelope, until 1913. And when it did, it was still such an unusual phenomenon that postcards show up what it looked like. Let me give you two more images here that contemplate the last two. Here's a picture by George Bingham, the American painter, of an election in mid-19th century America. And what do you see? It's a little chaotic, right? Politicians are pressing party tickets on individuals before they get to the top of the steps. There's a drunken guy who's unable to stand up, who's being dragged up to vote. There's some knife games. There's a brawling man. It's kind of Hogarthian in spirit. And I think it's hard to tell whether this is sort of celebration of the festive air of an election or actually a picture of corruption or both. Now compare this to the French postcard showing the new style just before the First World War. Okay, there's a picture of a French election. Now voting has become something else, something about the epistemic dignity of individual men who are isolating themselves to vote their interior consciences, which we know will then be recorded person by person in a numeric form. Most of us now accept the French one as looking kind of normal. We do this thing of going to participate in this public ritual in these private booths, and it seems right to us. And this switch, which became universal by the First World War, produced no violent responses on the model of the Age of Revolution. In fact, I think what happens is that politics, in a way, catches up to more familiar forms of choice making in other areas and helps solidify them further. I think also this kind of new style of voting helps make women's suffrage possible by organizing it in such a way And since we've seen women are already associated with these kinds of choosing modes, it helps make that paradigm possible. And we now generally assume that the only legitimate form of choice when it comes to political life as a citizen is private, secret, rooted in a combination of values, self-interest, biases, and tastes that we take to be our own preference. And this holds against all other kinds of divides: race, gender, ethnicity, religion. And it's not to say that we necessarily pick a president the same way we pick a tea kettle, but there are some striking similarities about this interior-exterior translation, about the specialized space for the activity, and the specialized technology used. Menus, ballots, drop-down menus, whether we put a check in a box or an X or a link. All of this suggests, as we follow the rules doing this, often without thinking about them very much because we've internalized them, that we live in the age of choice now, in which democracy and capitalism have become aligned around this particular action. That this is the meeting point in various ways of our economic and our political lives. Again, I want to say a few more things and then I'll stop talking. This obsession was not actually an immediate outgrowth of the age of revolutions. They were unaligned for a long time. This newer mode was slow to arrive at dominance. It really doesn't happen until after the Second World War. But I think it has gradually enveloped all of us, even those of us with very limited opportunities, and its occasions serious resentments around the globe, as well as new conceptions of freedom. Excuse me. So what are the implications of accepting this story? One, I think it means that the history of democracy is actually due for some reperiodization. The concept of collective self-rule or popular sovereignty without a king is certainly central to the age of revolutions. But I think there's a second major turning point in democratic life. And as the electorate expanded, what the electorate was asked to do changed substantially enough that what it meant to make a political determination changed as well. From a civic reckoning in which the public, however restricted, was called upon as a new authority that was entrusted with doing what was best and right for the collective flourishing of everyone, voting was remade conceptually and practically as a largely private determination and a math problem dependent on aggregation on a mass scale. This is a profound enough change that I think we can call it a second democratic revolution. Another consequence, though, if you were going to follow this story through, would be less academic and more personal to us as citizens now. Because I think one of the values of history, I'm probably preaching to the converted here, is that it allows us to see what we might not otherwise see. Essentially, it allows us to see what we're taking for granted. And I think we vote now in ways that seem to us natural, the same way we order up a restaurant menu without giving it a substantial amount of thought. We do it almost in a bubble, like an errand to be completed. In the US, it's not a requirement, it's not a holiday, it's not even very celebratory. The American political theorist Benjamin Barber once compared it to using a public toilet. That would be an extreme example. But I think it's important as we think about how to hold on to voting as a wave of right-wing populism envelops a lot of the globe, to also rethink what we're doing when we're voting and whether the social contract of today is the social contract of yesterday or not. I think we celebrate, rightly so, the expansion of Paine's vision to more people and more places all the time, and that's not wrong. But I also think there's some opportunity in all this to think about what we've lost and to think about the ways in which modern choice in its expansion has not always given us greater self-determination. And I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much indeed. I'm just going to stop your sharing here.
Terrific. Thank you.
And What a rich set of ideas you've set out in front of us. I've got a list of I don't know how many questions here, but I'm going to encourage anyone who wants to ask a question or to make a comment. If, as is our usual practice, you could just put a one-line summary of your question and comment in the chat. I will call upon people in the order that those questions or comments appear in the chat. And while people are mulling over what to add, I wonder if I might ask the first question. And it's an attempt to read the contemporary culture wars, I suppose, through the lens that you've been giving us in this presentation. And it will go something like this, I think. So that there are these two choices. There's the Herculean choice of virtue against vice, which of course is very clear that once you recognize virtue as virtue, that there's only one real choice that you can responsibly make in that case. And then there's the coquette's choice, which is arbitrary, that there's no right suitor to choose. And both of those are therefore not meaningful or real choices, in the sense that with one, well, it's obvious, and with the other, it doesn't matter. And I wonder the extent to which we have found ourselves now in a situation where we're caught on the horns of that dilemma in terms of the choices we're required to make. So on the one side, you've got the Rousseauian general will type of choice. There is a general will. It pre-existed any choice that you want to make about it. And the only option you've got is either to recognize it or not. And one of those is correct and the other is incorrect. And it seems to me that part of the culture wars today is that both sides of politics have that sort of approach. There is only one right answer, and you either acknowledge that, you recognize that, or you are to some extent in bad faith. There's no legitimate way of choosing the other side apart from being devious in some way. But also there's a sense accompanying that very awkwardly in which in our contemporary cultural moment there's also the political choice is the coquette's choice. No one really knows. And therefore the choice that you make of the ballot box is also utterly preferential. And I wonder the extent to which the difficulty is trying to find a position that is neither the Herculean choice, where there is only one right answer, and anyone who chooses wrongly is morally culpable, and the coquette's choice, which is it doesn't really matter. There's nothing riding ultimately on this choice, and whether that might be a way to try and parse out what's happening in the contemporary culture wars.
It's a really interesting formulation. I mean, I think what's wrong with it's easy in some ways to say what's wrong with the Herculean choice. Well, it's majoritarian, it forces only one good answer to anything, and it's anti-liberal in that sense, in the pluralistic sense. But what's wrong with the other position is also abundantly clear. It could be pure selfishness, it's without regard for anything else. And I think one danger of our modern conversation about choice is that we've made choice itself into the moral good. And so the question is, could you keep a kind of framework about individual self-determination, but also suggest there are moral stakes in some of our choices? Excuse me. I mean, one example would be in the COVID era, when people started appropriating my body, my choice to protest masking or vaccines. On the one hand, you might say, well, that makes a lot of sense. It's my body. I can determine what I'm going to do with it. But it seemed to disregard entirely that what one did with one's body had an effect on other people. So the choice in the abstract, it's a fine sentiment. But in a world in which there are contagious diseases, it's not a great path. And in that case, you might imagine the highest moral good is not just having the choice, it's making a choice that pays some attention to the common good. So I think I would have to agree almost entirely that the two outlined positions on their own give us sort of two unappealing possibilities, and that any kind of successful liberal democracy has to have borrowed some of the kind of moral seriousness of the Hercules story, but some of the autonomy of the Coquette story.
Absolutely. It's sort of a Goldilocks moment, I suppose, there in
Yeah,
between.
maybe that's right. That's right. That's a good way to put it.
Uh, as we wait for the people to come forward with their questions, I might just follow it with my second, if I could, which is to come back to something you were saying in the first half of the presentation, which really struck me, which was the idea of the way that the notion of choice has insinuated itself in our cultural and social landscape. And there was a moment at when this appeared really peculiar, when people weren't talking about choice.
Mm.
And I wonder about the extent to which that's a rhetorical change and the extent to which it's a substantial change, i.e., is it the case, to what extent is this correct, that it's always been about choice? So even absolute monarchy is about choice. It's simply about who gets to do the choosing. So when Louis XIV says "L'état c'est moi," that's him exerting his choice over the whole nation. So there is no non-choosing dispensation. It's just that the sphere of who gets to be involved in one way or another. And I love the way you problematized voting and showed how complex that is. So who gets to be involved has expanded, but the very idea that our political system is based upon choice is perennial and inescapable, because at some point someone has to choose something, even if it's
Right.
the absolute.
That's true. So of course there's always, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that if you're saying, have people always made choices? Yes, of course they have. Have rulers always had to make important decisions? Yes, of course. I mean, some element of choosing is part of what it means to be human. But I would say this, the very specific thing that I'm calling choice for this purpose, which is not decisions in general, but the selection of possibilities or options from menus of those possibilities. The ballot as the kind of, or the menu as the kind of emblem of this process is not a kind of universal feature of human life quite the same way. So something, I mean, it's not to say that people never made choices before, but three things happened. More people had opportunities to do so. The number of kinds of choices they made grew, and most importantly, the valuation of the process, both its nature and its importance to life, grew substantially. Here's another example that I think might be interesting. If you were a noble person in France in the 17th or 18th century, one of the reasons you would be free is because you would actually not have to make a lot of choices. What would you would already have a name, a title, property, probably a betrothed, um, goods, an income. Your freedom came from your independence, not from this sort of modern idea. If I make a lot of money, I can pick where I want to live. I can pick who I want to marry. I can pick all more things if I have more money and I have more status. So it's not just that the number of possibilities expands, it's the sense that our humanness comes from doing this particular thing of picking entertainments and travel and loved ones and everything else that I think is so remarkably important. And I think we don't see it that much because it's so ubiquitous. It's so much the air we breathe in so much of the world. Even countries, for instance, that we might not call democratic have some kind of voting usually these days, sham voting in many cases, but precisely because it's almost impossible to imagine a culture these days that doesn't want to say, we accord you some level of choice. I think I saw something just pop up.
Yes, incredibly helpful. I think Stephanie has a question to ask.
Great, go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. That was so interesting. I'd love to ask more about what you think the modern voters' mentality is of themselves as a chooser. So there was this really cool story about how the decisions made kind of went from this Herculean sort of monumental choice between right and wrong, and how people sort of understood that to be the case, took a lot of responsibility when choosing in terms of sort of adjudicating between these moral rights and wrongs, to the coquette, which who then decides between morally neutral options based on more preference. And it seems like that perhaps the modern voter might be, and this is where I would love your input, because I'm trying to piece together what the modern voter might be thinking, is they might be in the position perhaps of the coquette, because there might not be the case where there is this morally right versus wrong options available, but they do think they're in that Herculean position, because it seems like all the voters themselves do think that they're choosing correctly. So it seems like perhaps what's missing in their thought process might be going back to those the values that are underlying those Herculean decisions about right and wrong. So yeah, that's kind of a poorly formed question, but I'd love to get your input on.
It's an interesting question, because you're right, because people may definitely tell themselves, I'm doing the right thing here. The difference, though, might be that everybody's telling themselves a slightly different story. So one guy says, I'm voting for the right-wing party because it's really going to help the economy, or at least it's going to help my family budget. And another guy says, there's only one issue that interests me. I'm an abortion voter. I'm pro-choice, or I'm pro-life. That's going to be my vote. And certainly that person is acting on their moral concerns, but is not acting on the same set of ideas, and the things that motivate that person might be quite different from the guy who just said, I'm worried about the price of eggs. So in the end, what do? We decide that the best case scenario is to let everybody decide on different grounds and then aggregate what we get out of it. But I think that's still quite different from the notion of a kind of collective, the Mill position was something like, there still has to be something out there that's a kind of shared conversation, a deliberative democracy notion, say, of a kind of common good, even if it's rooted in compromise of sorts. So I think you're totally right that people, and I don't mean to suggest people are voting on nothing. It's just like, I like the color of his shirt, as opposed to, but because everybody's criteria are different to begin with, it's not even a shared conversation about what would be best, say, for the economy, because we haven't even agreed about what the grounds are on which we're making that decision. Some people, one person's voting because they're sick of incumbents, and one person's voting because they think there are too many men in politics and we need more women. I mean, they're all legitimate things you could decide, but they're so heterogeneous. And in many ways, that's how we imagine voting. And then we just try to tabulate all kinds of different, these kinds of people were more likely to vote on these issues in these places with this income level. I mean, but it's even the foundation of the study of people who study voter behavior is that there is no such thing as a common good or shared set of concerns. So I think that's kind of what I'm driving at, though your point is an important one.
Stephanie, would you like to follow up with anything?
No, that was really helpful and interesting. Just that explanation about how it seems as choice has become more prevalent, it's become so much richer and deeper, making it more more coquettish, but at the same time, all with important values, all the different choices. So yeah, that was really interesting. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I think, you can see this in the ways in which the internet takes up these older forms and basically translates them for us. And if you go to, if you're an Amazon shopper or something like that, right, you're literally collecting things, you're looking at menus, they're called drop-down menus, you collect things, you put them in a basket, you take them to a checkout, it tells you things like, because you like this, you might like that. I mean, it's sort of all of this is even exaggerated in our contemporary world, but it's not brand new. It's just a kind of intensification of, you might call it the supermarket model or something like that. The modern coquette is the person wandering the supermarket aisles who isn't asking, the butcher, what's your best meat today, but is just sort of going, that looks good. My kids would like that, pull it down. That was it's a different ethos of sorts.
Thank you.
I wonder if I could build on Stephanie's question. It really, really struck me, Sophia, what you said about this second fundamental change in democracy, how people used to enter the voting booth thinking, how do I represent or how do I choose for those around me? How do I reflect the common good in this choice I'm about to make? And now people enter the voting booth thinking, what's the best for me? And the ideology, I wonder if one could almost say the alchemy behind that is a sort of invisible hand logic now, isn't it? It's if everybody goes and decides what's best for them, somehow out of that will emerge what we can call the common good. And it would seem to me, on the basis of what you've said, that that's just as problematic as the invisible hand theory within economics. And I'm just wondering if that is a somewhat correct diagnosis, what's the prognosis? And I wonder if it's something to do with what you were saying in your response to Stephanie's question around the need for a public discussion about the criteria upon which we choose when we enter the voting booth. Like that, there's a very thin sort of public discourse around what are we doing when we vote and what might be a good basis upon which to vote. And then how on earth one might encourage that sort of discussion in the current political climate that we have. And so such that people might enter the voting booth with a richer sense of what it is they are doing and how this individual act fits into a broader sense of the common good.
Yes, I think invisible hand's a very interesting analogy there because yes, there is some idea that a kind of magic takes place even within a ballot box. I mean, the ballot box that was used for the first parliamentary elections by secret ballot in England, which were held in an off year in Pontefract. And you can see it's like a talismanic ballot box. You can go visit it today in the town museum, which I did. And the idea is really that a kind of magic takes place by the time everybody's put their individual decisions into this thing, the urn, that it will kind of, by some kind of sleight of hand, turn into the people's decision. And it is essentially the social contract made physical in some way. Which I think is interesting. I mean, you could think about the sort of physical representations over time of the social contract, and one of them is certainly the ballot box as emblematic. There's some interesting iconography for it, especially in the 19th century. So yes, that is part of the process, is a kind of faith in this transformative step. And that's what I kind of meant about the gains and losses. The gain, the secrecy, is a gain in a sense, because you could imagine people feeling tremendously pressured to vote in very particular ways, the ways their landlords wanted them, or the way their bosses wanted them, or the way their the father of the family wanted them to vote. And so the autonomy that we each get by doing this independently is very important. You could vote against a union, you could vote against anything else. That said, the secretization is also the privatization. And it also means that, nobody is, I mean, it's sort of considered a bad faith thing to force somebody to say how they voted or why they voted or what they do. And there are even cases, you hear people say, I don't tell my children how I vote because I think it's private. And with the suggestion that somehow this is a purely kind of interior process that need not be made explicit except in that one moment when you're putting the paper into or pressing the button on the electronic voting machine. So I see a gain and I see a loss And we talk more about the gains, but I think the losses are important too.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's incredibly important to highlight both of them. And I just, as I give people their last opportunity to come forward with a question, if you have one, speak now or forever hold your peace. Let me just follow up on
It's certainly fine if people don't have questions. That's it.
On what you just said there. The very idea that we should want to keep our votes so private. I'm thinking, what does that say about us? I'm imagining that the coquette would be more private about her choice than Hercules would. Now, if there is a clear virtue, one would gain nothing by not wanting to be identified with that choice. Whereas if it's, I prefer this lover rather than that lover, then you can understand that one might want to keep that quiet. So I wonder if latent in the idea of wanting to keep your vote private, there's a sense that it is arbitrary.
I think there it is. I mean, I like the description of that as latent. Yes. I mean, it's kind of a tacit understanding that you might be the world's most responsible voter, but we won't know that because you're doing it privately. But on the other hand, if you still are totally entitled to go in, and if you only like to pick, the numbers on the left-hand side and you prefer people with this kind of name over that kind of name, there's nobody says your vote disqualified for that reason. If you've never heard of any of the people and you just want to put your mark on the page, that's perfectly legitimate form of voting. Where I live in Pennsylvania, I haven't lived here my whole life, so it still strikes me as odd. We vote for the judges of all kinds of courts that most people have never heard of. And there's, say, 40 names under the Court of Common Pleas or something. And most states you don't vote for those offices, they're appointed positions, but here you vote for them. And in a way, it's an entirely arbitrary process because nobody's ever heard of any of these people and no one has any idea what they do. And it's said that wherever your name is on the ballot, the first ones win, the 10 out of the 40 and that's determined by lottery because how else are you going to put the position on the ballot? So in that sense, everybody goes through voting that's a little bit, has nothing to do with who's going to perform the job well or who represents your values. So in that sense, there isn't, we all, myself included, engage in voting. Part of our voting is, in a sense, just like picking a straw. It's a random process. Now, is that more democratic than if the Bar Association appointed the best lawyer? Maybe, but it doesn't necessarily get you a better candidate. So it has more to do with this older notion that for the office to have legitimacy, the people should have determined who it is.
Absolutely. And whatever else a process like that does or does not do, it stops one person wielding all the power of being able to appoint those people, which is,
right.
I suspect, for many people, in and of itself, worth it, even if you end up with a random choice. I think Stephanie,
isn't that interesting? Yeah, I think that's right.
Had one follow-up. So Stephanie, I'll invite you to ask
go ahead,
your follow-up, and then we'll end with this question.
Okay.
Gosh, high stakes. No, that's so interesting. This conversation about the idea of what secrecy can both introduce in terms of advantages and disadvantages. And I can't help but just really think about perhaps some of the disadvantages as we're talking about this sort of shift from the Herculean choice to the choice of the coquette. But I was wondering if you think it might actually go further than that, rather than the choices being able to be arbitrary or morally neutral, it actually could allow for moral escapism or sort of like permitting a certain type of choice to be made based on maybe immoral values if one so chooses, or things like that. I'm just thinking of, for example, the anonymity online, for example. We've seen what that brings out of certain people. So I was just thinking what that might be doing in the ballot box. Of course, the decisions that one can make in that ballot box are hopefully starkly right or wrong, but I was just wondering about this this idea of how the values underlying the decisions, not only are they not cohesive, it seems, in society, but now they're very permissive. So yeah, I was just wondering your thoughts.
Yeah, very. I mean, you can really think about this. It starts to open up a whole bunch of really interesting questions. What your comments made me think of is the phenomenon, especially this happened during the first Trump election in the US, but it's happened elsewhere too, with where people run on right-wing platforms, especially far-right parties. Some people know it's a little socially unacceptable, and they actually don't want to tell pollsters that they are really enthusiastically voted for the AfD in Germany or something like that, right? They know that there's some sort of taboo in perhaps, or maybe their neighbors or something won't like their non-centrist positions. And so they essentially disguise their vote. And it turns out that, there's always the surprise element. The party did better than pollsters thought, because they haven't, and that means people are sort of saying one thing and sometimes doing something else, because they are at some level torn between social acceptability and, or what you want to tell your friends, and actual preference when the time comes. So you can see how it could loosen certain inhibitions being in private. It could also, in the positive sense, allow you to vote your conscience in a way that you might have felt constrained otherwise. But I do think that, the reason polling often doesn't match voting is not just that the pollsters do a bad job, but because people don't always honestly represent themselves in their public-facing way to their private-facing way. I hadn't really thought about that much until you phrased it that way, but that's what sort of comes to mind thinking about this. Somebody's just asked a question over here.
Indeed. And I'll invite Cesarine, to please ask your question. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Thank you, Sophia. I really enjoyed the imagining of voting as a celebration of consensus rather than bringing on such divisiveness. And it certainly brought up for me my own family history of people coming from communist country to a democratic one, and the celebration of choice that comes with that journey. And I wondered if you see or imagine a pathway back to voting in that way, voting as a celebration of consensus and community.
Right. What an interesting question. Well, I'll say two things about that. You're absolutely right that after the Second World War, the Allies, and especially the US, sort of decided that choice was one way to make the case for what was different from both fascism on the one hand and communism on the other, was to suggest that the combination of consumer choice and political choice was what distinguished kind of American style democracies. And they really, it was very explicitly made this case. And so, this seemed to be a kind of winning rhetoric, and it eventually got kind of globalized in the aftermath of the Second World War in ways that, some nations have pushed back against in interesting ways, but almost nobody has been sort of totally apart from that. So but then that opens the question, as you say, about what kind of choice is it that these capitalist democracies have staked themselves to. And there are places that make voting more celebratory than some others. There are places, I don't know where you're speaking to me from, but it depends where you're based, but places where the day is a celebratory day, a holiday of sorts, and places like the US where voting is actually kept suppressed in part by the fact it happens on a Tuesday. Nobody has school off. Nobody has work off, and you sort of sneak in as quickly as you can to get this task done. And lots of people don't get to it because they work long hours, and and the polls close at a certain hour, and that's that. And less than 50% of the population votes even in the most important elections, because it's not compulsory either. So, you know, and the US is a particularly bad example for our culture in terms of making voting into something easy to do and sacred in a way. There are probably ways to build a kind of celebratory, festive quality into voting without creating my picture for the 19th century of a kind of, you know, anyone votes and, you know, you can barely stand up, you can vote kind of thing. Elections used to be described as rowdy and dangerous in lots of places. And, you know, this new kind of voting made them orderly and proper. But they also, of course, became intimidating. Some people don't want to vote because they're really state affairs. So they're kind of pros and cons. But I could imagine, as I think you're suggesting, a celebratory process that was a little bit more like felt more like a holiday and less like a duty or just like a chore. In the US, the voting booths are most crowded early in the morning because people have to go before they go to work. So if you want to, you know, the longest lines are at 7 a.m. and then the middle of the day isn't so bad. But it's not a great way to get people out.
Thank you. Zrinka, would you like to follow up with anything?
No, thank you. That was great. That was really enjoyable. Yeah, I was really thinking about whether divisiveness is so cemented into our society at this point that maybe we can't go back. But yeah, I really like that answer.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think, you know, we're talking about this as a moment that seems precarious around the globe, less in Australia perhaps than elsewhere, but, you know, in many parts of the globe, there has been kind of democratic backsliding, especially in some of the biggest democracies, Brazil, India, the United States, certainly places like Hungary, parts of the former Soviet satellite states. And right, it's hard to be sanguine about any of this, but it's also hard to predict where we're going. There could be a massive backlash against all of this. Or it could be that that people are finding democracy no longer particularly effective, especially when it comes to the kinds of global problems that we face today that national democracies seem in a way powerless to do much about, from climate change to refugee problems and a kind of nihilism that may lead us away from thinking elections are a good way to solve our problems. I mean, I could see either possibility, but I think I was naive to think until quite recently that these things were more solid than now appear to be. So on that pessimistic note, yeah.
Well, exactly. On that rather sombering note, it just remains for me to very richly and sincerely thank Sophia Rosenfeld, our speaker for today, for not only a really thought-provoking and careful presentation, but also for the way that you've so richly engaged with our questions as well. So please do join with me in thanking Sophia Rosenfeld.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. And thank you for inviting me to join in your conversation.